Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our topic is strategy, and more specifically, space advantage. The following game we are going to see being played by one of the greatest strategic players of all times, Anatoly Karpov, against an extremely good, strong grandmaster Artur Yusupov in 1993, is a perfect game to demonstrate in how to gain space advantage and then what to do with it. Of course, as normal, one advantage usually is not enough in itself to develop to a win. However, usually we try to acquire another one or two or more advantages, and combined it usually leads to a win. Well, let's get started with the game. Here we go. White played d4, black responded knight f6, c4, e6. Here white has the option to allow the Nimzo Indian by playing knight c3 and then bishop b4, or to avoid it, and that's what Karpov did, knight f3. And now black plays the Queen's Indian, very typical and actually used to be extremely popular in the 1980s and 90s. And here white has many ways to play. Develop the dark squared bishop to f4 or g5, play knight c3, play e3, or even a3, what Kasparov used to like to play back in the 1980s. But perhaps the most popular move of them all is to play g3 and to develop the bishop to g2. Here black in many games used to respond with bishop a6, which again used to be extremely popular and probably even today is considered the better option than developing the bishop to b7, which is its natural square. It may seem weird at first. Why would a bishop want to go to a6? The truth is that the idea of that move would be, in this position, to attack obviously the pawn on c4, and with that try to create some kind of discoordination, lack of harmony between the white pieces. Now white would have various choices to defend the pawn with the queen, or play knight d2. Obviously the drawback of knight d2 would be that the knight didn't develop to its ideal square on c3, where it would attack two central squares, is obviously more active than on d2, and also would at least temporarily lock up the dark squared bishop's diagonal. And of course the main move right now for white is to play b3, protecting the pawn. But interestingly, practice has shown that it's certainly a well-playable line, and perhaps in fact more advisable for black to go for that rather than what black did in this particular game, bishop b7, although we have to add that this is the old main line which up to the 1980s was exclusively played. Now naturally white responds with bishop g2 developing, and black played bishop e7. Another often played move would be bishop b4 instead, provoking the white bishop to go to d2 and then to retreat to e7, with the idea that the bishop on d2 is actually in a worse position than it would be on c1, because oftentimes in this opening white likes to play b3, bishop b2, and for that indeed the bishop on d2 would be in an inferior position than the bishop is in its initial square. And right now white could naturally castle, which has been played in hundreds of master games, but theory recommends nowadays, and even back in the 90s when this game was played, to play knight c3 first and commence the fight over the center, and specifically the e4 and d5 squares. Now white is trying to play d5 in order to gain space on one hand, and on the other hand to lock up the diagonal of the light squared bishop of blacks on b7. So after knight c3 it is considered the best response to play knight e4 and in fact start the battle over the center, and don't just allow white to occupy it by either advancing the d-pawn forward, or a very common idea also would be play queen c2 and then e4 and occupy the e4 center square with another pawn. So black's move was certainly a correct one by playing knight e4, and white here typically plays bishop d2, which at first may be a bit surprising of a response because it allows for black to trade a knight for the bishop, and generally in open positions we certainly don't recommend it. This position is kind of a semi-closed or semi-open position. Neither there are files opened, neither they are logged in, so it's kind of an in-between type of position where generally we do not want to give up a bishop for a knight. However, in this particular case, practice has shown that it's not a bad choice for white. In fact, it is the best choice, and for black it's not a particular gain to do that trade. Why? As we shall see in this game, the position will get rather closed than opened up, and therefore in those type of positions the bishop lose their powers and knights are to be preferred. So right now black played bishop f6, which is again still considered perhaps the best response, and white is pushing the issue by playing queen c2, targeting black's knight a second time and certainly asking the knight, go somewhere, trade somewhere. And of course, if black already made all this effort in getting to e4, the best choice is actually to trade on d2, which white captures back. So now we got to this typical position for this opening, where black has a pair of bishops, but nevertheless white, because has better control of the center as well as some space advantage, is slightly to be favored. And black right now responded with d6, and here comes the first important moment of the game, where white plays d5. It's a very typical idea, one for you to remember, where white is gaining further space in the center and is locking up the diagonal of black's bishop on b7. Right now black cannot win a pawn by trading on c3 and then trying to capture the pawn on d5, because the black pawn on g7 would be hanging, so that's not a good option, and therefore black responded with a natural move, castling. At this point already white indeed is being threatened by black's bishop trading on c3, and then if queen takes back, then indeed black wins a pawn, or of course if the pawn takes, that's certainly something to avoid, the doubling up of those pawns. And here Karpov played energetically and continued with knight d4, centralizing the knight and provoking the movement of the e-pawn on e6, although at the moment the pawn is not yet hanging because of the pin situation, but white will castle certainly very soon, and then it will be a threat. But in fact it's more important, I think, in this case, that the white knight is heading to c6, and that will be a very interesting situation, which we'll see right away. Black responded with e5, attacking the knight, and the knight happily moves to c6. Now in this case, if black would trade on c6, the beautiful part is that white would get a pawn there and then would have the d5 square available for any of his pieces, either the knight or even the queen. It would be a humongous advantage for white. Black instead played queen d7, and now we're actually facing a very interesting and unusual situation. White simply now traded on b8. So what does this mean? It means that the white knight moved 1, 2, 3, 4 moves, right? f3, d4, c6, and then b8. 4 squares to exchange a knight which hasn't moved at all. So on the surface it clearly seems that this doesn't make sense at all, and this is a humongous waste of time. However, white is specifically heading to a position where we'll have a knight on the board against a bad bishop. Of course, white has in mind eventually one day to trade the light squared bishops, and then we'll have a pure situation of a good knight versus bad bishop situation. The good news is, from white's perspective, that bishop on b7 doesn't have much potential. The diagonal the bishop is on right now, it's pretty much locked in, and the other diagonal, a6, f1, also has a white pawn pretty much locking its way. The only other diagonal the bishop could get to is c8, and very interestingly, in fact immediately, we'll see what white does about that. White played h4, a very fine move. On one hand, gains further space advantage, but I think more importantly in this case, white is preparing in the right moment to play bishop h3. For example, if the black bishop would appear on c8 right now, white would be ready to trade those bishops by bishop h3 and then immediately trade. If you think ahead for the endgame one day, you can clearly see that because of the pawn structure, and especially the blocked pawns d5 and d6, that defines the position. And therefore those pawns, for example on the white side, the c4 and d5 pawns, could be potential targets of the black light squared bishop. At the same time, they are also restricting the power of our bishop. So when we talk about the light squared bishops in this position, it's clear that white has the bad one of the two. Therefore, it is in white's very clear interest to exchange those pair of bishops and leave on the board the knight versus the bishop. So at this moment, black continued by playing a5, trying to get a little room for the pieces. But it doesn't bother white whatsoever, and simply responded with a4. Again, putting another pawn on light square, which of course makes it even more important, the goal to eventually exchange those light squared bishops. With white's last move, the other idea was also to make sure black doesn't get to any activity by playing b5 at a later point, maybe being prepared with bishop a6. Now if you look at the position, it's quite clear that white has space advantage on the queen side because the pawn is on d5. It's also clear that white is doing very well in the center, and also actually doesn't do badly on the king side. That is of course not a good view from the other side of the board. Well, let's see how the game continued. And here black responded with rook f8 and came e4. This is to gain further space, to make sure black will not have the opportunity at a later point to activate his dark squared bishop by advancing his e5 pawn. Also, the idea is to grab control of the f5 square before black does. Black here played h5, and this encouraged white to castle all of a sudden to the other side of the board. Why? Because it gives white realistic hope to actually create a potential attack even on the king side by playing g4 in the near future. This is one of the critical positions in the game where each side needs to pick plans. Let's first start with black. What are black's options? There are 4 potential breakthrough points. One is b5, which seems certainly very hard to accomplish in the foreseeable future. There is to play c6. There is to play g5, which certainly pretty much is out of question because it's not a good idea to open files in front of your king. And lastly, there is to play f5. The problem with f5 is that it opens up the position in front of your own king area, and especially in view of black already being played h5, it's probably an extremely risky one. c6 I think is the best option of these, and it could have been played right away as well, although white certainly keeps the advantage here as well. After queen c6, white would protect the pawn b3, queen c5, and now king b2, simply preventing the queen a3 check. And white's advantage is clear in this case as well. Nevertheless, this was anyway black's best try in this critical position after castling queenside. Black instead played g6, trying to play the other plan, perhaps to play bishop g7 and f5, although black never got to that. White played bishop h3. That's an important move because it positions the bishop ready whenever its counterpart from b7 would try to get activated through c8, it will be ready to trade. Came queen a7 and king c2. Right now, if black plays bishop g7 instead of king g7, which was played in the game, then white would not waste time and not wait until black plays f5, but immediately play g4 and start opening the position against black's king. So let's go back to the game where black, instead of bishop g7, rather played king g7. And white responded with f3, getting ready for the g4 plan. Let's go back for another moment to that critical position where we stopped a few moves earlier, when white just castled. We talked about the black possible plans, and I meant to mention also some of the white possible plans here. And white has also 4 potential breaking points. One is to play b4, which certainly we only want to do once we get to an endgame. Another one may be in order to get our king towards the black pawns is by sacrificing our c-pawn with advancing c5. Naturally, then again, we're only talking about a potential endgame idea. However, in the middle game, there are 2 other much more realistic ideas, and that is to play f4 or g4, opening up the position. So let's go and see how the game continued. Bishop h3, as we said, queen e7, king c2, getting out from the same diagonal where our queen is, king g7 and f3, and black played rook h8. Now comes a few preparatory moves, improving the positions of our pieces. The beauty of the position is, from white's perspective, that white is in no rush whatsoever to open up the position and can pick the absolutely perfect time for himself. Rook h2, bishop a6, and knight b5. If here black would choose to trade the bishop for a knight on b5, white would recapture with the c-pawn, opening up the c-file, and then we can already see how the c7 pawn can become a major target for the white pieces, especially in view that the white bishop is beautifully positioned on h3, controlling the c8 square, a key square where that pawn could be protected from. Black responded with rook f8, and came king b1, queen d8, queen d3, bishop e7. As you can see, white is making sure that black doesn't get to play f5, has 3 pieces on that square, rook e2, and here black played bishop c8, which certainly makes white's life easier by offering this exchange that black should have avoided. White traded, and it was time to get the rook to g1 behind the g4 idea. Of course, f4 wasn't a bad plan either, but this was Karpov's preference in this game. Came bishop d8. In this moment, black could have played f5, but white would have responded with f4, and we can see how the white pieces are better prepared for the opening of the position. Also, we can see the fact that the white king is in a safer position than black is after this potential opening. For example, if now takes, rook takes, and black plays bishop f6, white is ready to play g4 takes, open the position up fully, and now the best choice is to play knight d4, getting to e6, therefore forcing black to trade, and it's pretty much a winning position for white because the black king is in a very delicate position. Let's go back to the position after rook g1, where black responded by playing bishop d8 to free up the queen. And here again white could play f4, but white played a very tempting move, knight a7, to reposition the knight to c6, where it's even more powerful than it was on b5. Came queen h3 and queen c2. White is in no rush. Rook e8 and knight c6. Bishop f6, rook f2, queen d7, queen e2, rook hf8. Also remember that in those days typically games were played with a time control where you had 2 hours or 2.5 hours to make 40 moves. So that can also be an explanation of a little bit extra maneuvering compared to what may necessarily be needed. Rook h2, rook h8, queen f2, rook ef8, and rook f1. g4 was certainly a good idea also, but as I mentioned a minute ago, I think it's a psychological reason not to rush, because there's nothing that black can do. So white can certainly pick the moment when he or she feels most comfortable in breaking through with g4 or f4, not just in the position but also with the time control in consideration. Black played king g8, and the time arrived. Finally, Karpov felt ready to open the position. Now if black trades on f4, of course we take back with the pawn, and then we'll follow up with a soon e4, e5 push ahead. Black played queen g4, and now white is offering to trade queens. Came rook e8, and white, that's exactly what white is shooting for, trading queens. And now f5. The future of black's dark square bishop is really hopeless. g5 and h5. So now it's quite clear that black can only hope for a draw. Actually, that was clear a long time ago, but now things are really sad. So the question only is where and when will white break through. White has several plans. One is to play b4. Remember the plan I mentioned earlier that only can be considered in the endgame, where here we are. And the other one to play c5. And we shall see both of those plans come through real soon. An additional problem that black has is the weakness of the g4 pawn. And one day that knight can simply jump back all the way to e3 and grab that pawn when the time arrives. Black played rook a8, king c2, king g7, king c3. White is finally getting the king into the game. As we know, in endgames that's certainly a good idea, and specifically is preparing the b4 push. That's the reason why black is trying to keep his rook on the a file, so after that potential opening could target white's a4 pawn. Came rook a1 and rook a8 and b4. White is ready. If black takes, white can just take back with the king and protect the a4 pawn at the same time. And then bring the rook from h2 to a2, and then jump back with the knight to e3 as I mentioned and grab the g4 pawn. And then come back and at the right moment play a5. Black continued, sitting and waiting, and white closed up the position even on the queen side. However, not without a gain. Now the black rook has to go to a7, which could be captured. However, there is no rush, because the white knight actually on c6 is more powerful at the moment than black's rooks, since there are no open files on the board. h6, threatening to promote that pawn. Bishop had to go to the corner, and now f6. We can see total domination from white side. A pawn sacrifice to open the f-file. Takes rook f1, of course, bishop h8, and now grabbing the exchange, takes back and picking up some more pawns. Black is helpless. The position is lost. And now a final breakthrough with c5, very important, so the king can come in and eat up some of the black pawns and then promote a pawn. Black already resigned after the rooks got exchanged. What a beautiful game to demonstrate how to take advantage of space advantage. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this position, white has a significant material advantage, a bishop and a knight. However, the knight is under attack, and if the knight moves, the bishop will be lost. And typically, a rook and bishop versus rook endgame is a draw, and so is a rook and knight versus rook endgame. So the question is how to make an exception to the rule. Well, try to solve it, not terribly difficult, and then check if your solution was correct. The only way white can win this game if either white succeeds to checkmate black's king, or, which is more likely, to win black's rook. And that's exactly what happens. Knight e2 check, king captures, rook e5 check, and now doesn't matter where the king goes, it needs to step into a fork and bye-bye rook. Simple but very powerful endgame. Thank you for listening, and I hope you got a little better idea about space advantage. Bye-bye. Until next time.